Alright, so today I just wanted to sit down and draw with you guys for a bit. No crazy tutorial, no complicated theory, nothing like that. Just a chill drawing session where I show you how I actually go over my drawings and turn them into a finished piece. Because I feel like a lot of times when we watch art videos online, everything looks super polished and perfect. You only see the final result, or maybe a very fast time lapse. But you rarely get to see the real process behind it. Like the small decisions, the little mistakes, the moments where you zoom in way too much and suddenly your drawing looks weird. So in this video, I thought it would be fun to just walk through my entire process while I render this piece. I'll explain what I'm thinking, why I make certain choices, and also share some small tips that help me when I'm drawing. And honestly, think of this video less like a tutorial and more like we're just hanging out while drawing. So grab your sketchbook, open your drawing app, or just relax and watch the process. Alright, let's start with the drawing. For me, every drawing always starts with a very rough sketch. And when I say rough, I really mean rough. At this stage, I'm not trying to make anything look pretty or clean. I'm just trying to capture the basic idea of the drawing. The pose, the proportions, the overall structure. I think a lot of beginners feel like their sketch has to look good before they move on to the next step. But honestly, the sketch is supposed to be messy. That's the whole point. It's the stage where you explore ideas and figure out what works and what doesn't. So when I start sketching, I usually use a fairly large brush with low opacity, and I just start placing rough lines on the canvas. Sometimes I draw the same line multiple times. Sometimes I erase parts and redraw them. And sometimes the drawing changes completely halfway through the sketch. And that's completely normal, because the sketch is not meant to be perfect. It's meant to be flexible. Another thing I do a lot during the sketch stage is zooming in and out. This is actually something that helped me a lot when I was trying to improve my drawings. When you zoom in too much, everything starts to look good because you're only focusing on a tiny part of the drawing. But when you zoom out, you suddenly see the entire composition. You notice if the head is too big. You notice if the shoulders feel awkward. You notice if the pose looks stiff. So throughout the sketching process, I constantly zoom out to check if everything still looks balanced. At this point, I'm mostly thinking about big shapes, not details. Things like the overall silhouette, the placement of the head, the direction of the shoulders, the flow of the hair. Details like eyelashes or clothing folds come much later. Right now, the goal is simply to make sure the structure of the drawing works. Eventually, after adjusting lines and moving things around, the sketch starts to feel solid. And once I'm happy with the overall structure, I move on to the next step. Going over the sketch. This is the part that the title of the video is about, going over the drawing. Basically, this is where the messy sketch slowly turns into something more defined. The way I usually do this is pretty simple. First, I lower the opacity of my sketch layer. Then I create a new layer on top of it. And on this new layer, I start redrawing the important lines more carefully. Now I'm not just randomly sketching anymore. I'm looking at the shapes I created in the rough sketch and trying to refine them. For example, if the face shape looked a little uneven in the sketch, I adjust it. If the jawline feels off, I redraw it. If the hair shape looks messy, I simplify it into clearer forms. At this stage, I'm basically asking myself one question. Does this shape make sense? Because good drawings are usually built on clear shapes. Even very complex artworks are actually made from simple forms that work together. Another thing I think about during this stage is line confidence. When you're sketching, lines are often shaky or overlapping. But when you go over the drawing, you want the lines to feel more intentional. So instead of slowly dragging the brush, I try to make confident strokes. Sometimes that means drawing a line quickly in one motion instead of slowly correcting it. This can take some practice, but it really helps improve the quality of your line work. And again, I'm not trying to make everything perfect. I'm just trying to make the drawing clearer and stronger than the rough sketch. Slowly, the shapes become more defined. The face becomes clearer. The hair starts to have structure. The drawing begins to look like an actual piece of artwork instead of just a rough idea. And once I feel like the structure is solid, I move on to the next step, adding color. Now we move into the coloring stage. But before we get into shading or lighting, I like to start with simple base colors. This step is actually very straightforward. I just fill each major part of the drawing with a flat color. For example, the skin gets one color, the hair gets another, the clothes get their own colors. The background might get a different tone as well. At this stage, the artwork looks very flat. There are no shadows yet, no highlights, just simple colors filling the shapes. And that's completely fine, because the purpose of base colors is not to make the drawing look finished. It's just to create a color foundation that we can build on later. Another thing that helps a lot during this stage is layer organization. For example, I usually keep different elements on separate layers. Skin on one layer, hair on another, clothes on another. This makes it much easier to adjust colors later without affecting the entire drawing. Sometimes I also use clipping masks so I can paint shadows on top of the base color without going outside the shape. These small workflow habits might seem simple, but they make the entire process much smoother. Once all the base colors are in place, the artwork finally starts to look more like a complete illustration. But we're still very early in the process, because the next stage is where the real transformation happens: rendering. Rendering is probably the stage that takes the most time. It's where the flat colors slowly turn into three-dimensional forms. And the way I usually approach rendering is by starting with big shapes first. This is something that helped me a lot when I was learning digital painting. Instead of immediately focusing on tiny details, I first block in the major shadows. So I ask myself, where is the light coming from? Which parts of the face are in shadow? Where would the hair naturally block the light? Where would clothing folds create darker areas? Once I have a rough idea of the lighting, I start painting the main shadow shapes. At first they might look a bit rough, but that's okay, because this stage is more about establishing the lighting than making everything look smooth. After that, I slowly start refining those shadows, blending some areas, sharpening others, and gradually the drawing begins to gain depth. This is usually the moment where the artwork starts to feel alive, because suddenly the face has form, the hair has volume, the lighting starts to create mood. And honestly, this is one of my favorite parts of the entire drawing process, because you can really see the transformation happening in real time. While rendering, I'm constantly making small decisions. Sometimes I adjust the colors. Sometimes I push the shadows darker. Sometimes I add highlights to make certain areas pop. And sometimes I even go back and change things from earlier stages. For example, maybe the hair shape doesn't work as well once I add lighting, so I might go back and adjust the silhouette. Or maybe the face looks slightly off once shadows are added, so I tweak the proportions again. This back and forth process is actually very normal. Art is rarely a straight line from start to finish. It's more like a constant cycle of adjusting, refining, and improving the drawing. And over time, the artwork slowly moves closer to the final result. And yeah, at this point the drawing is basically finished. Most of the rendering is done, the colors feel balanced, and the details are finally starting to come together. Usually when I reach this stage, I like to zoom out for a moment and just look at the entire piece instead of focusing on small areas. Because when you spend a long time drawing, you start getting used to the image. Sometimes you're so zoomed in on tiny details that you forget to check how the whole artwork actually looks. So I always try to zoom out and ask myself a few simple questions. Does the lighting still make sense? Do the colors feel balanced? Is there any part of the drawing that feels too distracting or unfinished? Sometimes I might still adjust small things here and there. Maybe I push the highlights a little more. Maybe I soften some shadows. Maybe I tweak the colors slightly so everything feels more unified. These small adjustments might not seem very noticeable, but they can really improve the final look of the artwork. And honestly, this polishing stage is something I really enjoy, because at this point the drawing already looks good, and you're just adding those last little touches that make everything feel complete. But at the same time, there's also an important lesson here: knowing when to stop. A lot of artists struggle with this. You keep zooming in, fixing tiny details, adjusting things again and again, and sometimes you end up overworking the drawing. So one thing I've learned over time is that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply step back and say, okay, this piece is done. Because every artwork is also part of your learning process. Instead of trying to make one drawing perfect forever, it's often better to finish it, learn from it, and move on to the next piece. That's how you improve over time. You draw, you learn something, then the next drawing becomes a little better, and the next one after that becomes even better. So yeah, that's pretty much my process for going over my drawings and turning them into a finished piece. Of course, every artist has their own workflow, and even my process changes depending on the artwork. Sometimes I focus more on line work. Sometimes I go fully painterly. Sometimes I experiment with completely different styles. And that's one of the things I love most about art. There's always something new to explore. There's always another way to approach a drawing. And every piece teaches you something new. So if you're learning digital art right now, just remember that progress takes time. Don't worry if your drawings don't look perfect yet. Every artist you see online started exactly the same way. The only difference is that they kept drawing, kept experimenting, and kept improving step by step. So just keep creating, keep practicing, and most importantly, try to enjoy the process. Because at the end of the day, drawing should still feel fun. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching this full process and seeing how I go over my drawings. If you did enjoy the video, feel free to leave a like, and maybe let me know in the comments what part of the drawing process you find the most challenging. Is it the sketch, the coloring, or maybe the rendering stage? I'd actually be really curious to hear about it. And if you want to see more videos like this where I talk through my art process, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.